Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how you can draw fur with coloured pencil using a watercolour base. So before we get into this, if you want to follow this along with a load of other different fur methods, then they are available over on Patreon in real time with full voiceover, and you can paint or draw along with me as we're doing these. As always, all the materials used throughout this process are listed in the description below, with links where you can find them on Amazon should you wish to check those out. So what I'm doing with this is actually putting down a watercolour base before we actually go in with our coloured pencils. So I'm adding watercolour and using it as if it was our midtones. So doing it this way, you avoid that waxy buildup that you get from adding layers and layers of pencils by using a layering and burnishing method. That's the method which I usually use, but this is an alternative if you don't like to use a lot of layers, or if you've got weak wrists or something like that. This is a really easy way to add down your light tones and your mid tones, and then just go straight in and add all of those darker colours on top. So what I'm using here are the Winsor & Newton Professional Range watercolours, and I'm just creating a base layer for a nice chocolate coloured fur. So I've just laid down a little bit of yellow ochre, then I'm going over with some sienna, and I'm just adding the darker colours of the watercolour into the darkest areas that I want on this circle. So in my case, the darker area are towards the left hand side of the circle and the lighter areas are on the right hand side. So I'm concentrating a lot of the watercolour onto the left hand side and just gradually building up until I get it to the required depth and darkness that I need for the type of fur that I'm painting or drawing. So all I'm doing is I'm using a wet in wet method. So I have wet the paper and then I'm going in with a really wet and saturated with colour brush and then adding that to the paper and then just moving it around until it's in the place that I want it to be. I found with this example though that because I didn't actually use a watercolour paper, I'm actually using the Bristol Board 500 plate. They didn't hold the watercolour that well and I did get a little bit of warping on my paper, but it's not so much of a problem for this demonstration. So I'm just concentrating all of those darker colours, moving them around on the left hand side until I'm happy with where they are. And then when I was happy, I just set it aside and let it dry. And as you can see, I've got a really dark left hand side and then the right hand side is a little bit lighter. So once you've got your watercolour base and you're happy with it, then you can start to add your pencils over the top. So for this example, I'm using the Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils, and I've just selected a few of my darkest tones. So I'm actually going for burnt sienna, walnut brown and dark sepia. And I'm also using the Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil to add a few of the highlights back into this. So what I've done is made sure that I have really sharp pencils. That's always crucial for when you're drawing fur. And I always make sure that I work in the direction that the fur is going in. So in my case, I'm going ever so slightly off at an angle and upwards. So I'm concentrating my fur strokes in the darkest area a lot more than in the lighter area. So you can see as I'm adding the fur strokes into this darkest area, I'm adding them in the direction that the fur is going and I'm grouping them quite close together. Doing it that way enables you to just build up a really nice colour and tone. As we're coming out towards the lightest area, I'm adding the fur strokes a little bit more sporadically, so adding them a little bit more sparse, just adding them here and there so that you get a little hint of colour in there. I then decided to actually go in with one of my midtones, and I'm just using a burnt ochre pencil, and I'm just using this so that I can soften the gradation between the dark and the light. So I'm just using this in exactly the same way, making sure it's really sharp and just working this pencil in the direction that all of that fur is going in. Just adding small lines because the fur that I'm demonstrating here is actually quite short and close to the skin. So just adding small lines all the way up to the lightest area now, and then going back in with some burnt sienna as well, just to help with that blend between the two areas. One of the drawbacks I find with this method is where I like to work and build up my layers and burnish as I'm going. When I'm using a watercolour base, I don't get that initial layer of colour down so that I can burnish subsequent layers. So I find when I work in this method that everything looks a little bit grainy, so I just have to work some of the colours over and over one another until I can get to that level where I can burnish how I like to blend and burnish. So I'm just going over with the luminance white pencil as well to add in that lightest area on the right hand side there. When you're working with a watercolour base, it's really easy for your lighter layers to go over because you haven't built up those layers and diminished the tooth of the paper as much. So when you're working with a watercolour base, obviously it preserves the tooth of the paper, so you're able to layer light colours over your darker ones really easily. So I found that the Caran d'Ache Luminance white pencil worked really nicely as a kind of burnishing technique for my lighter areas, and I just blended this out into the darkest areas a little bit more as well. I'm then going in with my darkest colours, and again just concentrating these in those darker areas. So when you're working with a watercolour base, you only really need to add your darkest colours and your lightest colours, no midtones. So I'm using the walnut brown to add some more fur lines and to help blend everything together. Again, working in the direction that the fur is going in, adding in tiny little lines and just trying to get the contrasts correct between my lights and my darks. What I like about this method is the fact that you can use your lighter colours over your darker colours really easily. So I'm continuing to group my pencil marks together just to try and create the illusion that there's some fur. You can still see the watercolour base shining through underneath, and again that's acting as our mid-tone. So what we would do if we wasn't using a watercolour base is build up from light to dark, whereas this we're adding in the mid-tone and then just adding the lights and the darks over the top. So it takes out a lot of heavy blending or burnishing if that's the way that you like to work. So I'm just adding the dark sepia now. This is the final pencil. I'm just adding this in the darkest areas and then spreading it through the rest of the fur as well, just to try and blend everything together, give everything the same sort of tone, just bring some sense of unity to the piece by adding the colours into the lightest areas as well. So that's pretty much it for this short tutorial. You can see the effect with the watercolour base. You don't really need to use as many layers with the pencil as you do if you're just layering and burnishing or blending. It's a much easier method if you want a sort of quick type of fur to do, and it's a lot easier to do if you have weaker wrists or if you don't like to burnish or you don't really like to blend. This method is really great because you can add those midtones. You preserve the tooth of the paper so your pencil strokes are easier to add over the top, and it gives a really nice effect. You can see all of those midtones showing through, you can see the watercolour underneath still. It gives a really smooth result once you've built up the colour to where you want it. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this. As always, thanks for watching this video guys. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel and tick that bell icon to be notified of all of my future videos. Don't forget to follow me on all of my social media sites. I'm on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and I will see you in tomorrow's video. Bye!